Hello and welcome to Geeky Bit. Today in tech history, we're gonna talk about SCSI. No, I'm not talking about something dirty or inappropriate. I'm talking about a interface that allowed you to talk to hard drives and other periphery. If the name SCSI wasn't bad enough, there was SASI before SCSI, developed by Shurgard Associates, best known for their floppy drives of the 1970s. SASI stood for Shurgard Associates System Interface, and it is compliant with SCSI 1. In 1982, the ANSI had to make an acronym that wasn't named after a company. Thus, SCSI was born. SCSI was supposed to be pronounced sexy, but Dale Allen said SCSI, and it stuck. SCSI stands for Small Computer System Interface. Much like SASI, SCSI provided a bridge between the low-level functionality of hard drives and communication to the computer's bus. That ability also allowed SCSI to be able to use other periphery as well. NCR Corp is said to have developed the first SCSI controller chip sometime around 1982. Adaptec was the best-known manufacturer of SCSI devices like controller cards. SCSI was popular with Apple and Commodore, while also being common in the server and workstation space of computing. SCSI seemingly died out in the late 90s to early 2000s in the home markets, but is still around and thriving in server markets. SCSI currently exists as SAS or Serial Attached SCSI, or FCP or SCSI over Fiber Channel. The modern versions differ as it is serial instead of parallel in these modern forms. IDE, PATA, or eIDE was a contemporary alternative to SCSI, with IDE being introduced in 1986 and later taking over the home market. No joke, if I talked about all of the SCSI standards and specs, this video would likely be an hour or two of me listing specs. So instead of listing out every single spec and type, these videos are more geared towards older tech and hardware, so we'll list the older specs of SCSI. There are three main port types to know about when we talk about classic SCSI. The first is 50-pin, then 68-pin, and lastly 80-pin. To muddle all of this, there is no clear path from 50-pin to 68-pin to 80-pin, while 50-pin was definitely the first. The only good news with all of that convolution of the different ports seems to be the compatibility with passive pin-to-pin conversion adapters. Here are what those three classic SCSI ports look like, from lowest pin count to highest pin count. Here is a three-way adapter between those classic ports, but you'll notice it does take power, as 80-pin SCSI has power in its port. Older SCSI had a lot more port types for external use as well, but as for classic SCSI port speeds, it ranged from 5 megabytes to 640 megabytes. SCSI used an ID system for each item on the SCSI bus to identify itself, as it could have several items on one cable. With all of that out of the way, let's talk about my history with SCSI. The first time I had ever saw SCSI was when I met a friend of my dad's he had made while taking an administrating Novell course. This was back in 1994. I believe that friend of my father's was named Dan. Anyways, so he was telling my dad that SCSI is where real hard drive data performance was at. Dan invited us over to his house so he could show my dad and myself how much faster SCSI was, as at the time my father was looking to build a new computer. It was this weird connector I'd never seen before. It was a SCSI 50-pin, and it looked kind of like an IDE, but was a bit longer. When Dan explained the work needed to get SCSI devices working, it seemed like a lot of extra steps. On the IDE side, it was just set the jumpers to select cable, slave, or master. I would like to pause the story for a moment and explain I had no input on early IDE pin naming conventions, so the names of those jumper settings are by no means names that I picked. Alright, let's continue on with the story. While SCSI was faster, it just didn't seem really worth it, as it cost a lot more to get SCSI up and running in a system. Ultimately, in 1995, by the time my dad built his computer, ATA2 was out with its 16 megabyte speeds. He got a Quantum Fireball IDE hard drive, and he was happy with the speeds he got. Here are my thoughts on SCSI. I didn't get much experience with SCSI till the early 2000s, and what experience I did get made me feel like it was very clunky with its ID system, at least for PCs. Unlike IDE, SCSI seemed to change interfaces at the drop of a hat, and would even flip-flop between those interfaces, and adapters back then cost a lot of money. I think all of the interface types and the randomness of which one was used and the ID system and the cost really made a lot of people lean towards IDE. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did making it, and if you did, please feel free to click that like button, and if you aren't subscribed so already, feel free to do so, and if you'd like to get notifications of future videos, click that bell button.